Jiho Kim pressed the control button on his wheelchair as the transport shuttle docked at Nexus Station. Through the viewport, he could see the massive structure of the Galactic Technical Institute stretching into space like a glittering city. His heart pounded with excitement and nervousness. This was it, the most prestigious engineering school in the galaxy, and somehow a human from Earth had made it in. The shuttle doors hissed open, and Jiho rolled forward into the bustling arrival terminal. Immediately, he felt the stares. Everywhere. He looked. Alien beings towered over him, or floated gracefully through the air. The Krillians were the most intimidating, 8 feet tall with 4 muscular arms and rocky skin that looked like living granite. They moved with confident strides, their multiple hands carrying equipment that would take 3 humans to lift. "Look at that," one Krillian student laughed, pointing directly at Jiho's wheelchair. "They really let anyone in these days, don't they?" His friend joined in the laughter. "How's he supposed to work in the labs, roll around and watch us do the real engineering?" The Zephyrians were no better. These bird-like creatures had beautiful shimmering wings that let them soar effortlessly through the station's high ceilings. They swooped down near Jiho, circling him like he was some kind of curiosity. "Poor little human," one Zephyrian chirped in a mocking tone, "stuck on the ground while the rest of us reach for the stars." Jiho kept his face calm, even though his cheeks burned with embarrassment. He'd expected this. On Earth, he'd dealt with stares and whispers his whole life. But somehow being mocked by aliens felt different. Worse, maybe because he'd hoped things would be different out here among the stars. Across the terminal, Mina Park watched the scene unfold. Her crystalline skin caught the station's lights and scattered them in tiny rainbows, a trait of her Altarian people. Through her telepathic abilities, she could sense the humans' embarrassment and determination mixing together like oil and water. It made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite understand. Her people, the Altarians, were known throughout the galaxy for their advanced minds and superior intellect. They rarely bothered with other species, considering most of them beneath their notice. Mina had been raised to believe this was simply the natural order. Some beings were meant to lead, others to follow. But watching the Krillians and Zephyrians mark this human student made something twist in her stomach. It felt wrong, though she couldn't say why. After all, the human did seem limited compared to the others. How could someone who couldn't even walk properly hope to succeed at the galaxy's toughest engineering school? Jiho finally made it through, the crowd to the registration desk. The automated system scanned his credentials and handed him a data pad with his schedule and room assignment. As he studied the information, he noticed several alien students still watching him, whispering among themselves. "Adaptive engineering and universal design," he read from his course list. A small smile crossed his face. Maybe the school had placed him in these classes for a reason. Maybe someone here understood that being different didn't mean being less capable. Mina found herself moving closer, curious despite herself. She'd never met a human before, and certainly never one who seemed so determined despite obvious challenges. Her telepathic senses picked up his thoughts, not the words, but the emotions behind them. There was hurt, yes, but also something else, something that felt like quiet confidence. As Jiho rolled toward the dormitory section, Mina made a decision that surprised even her. She would keep watching this strange human student, not out of pity or superiority, but because something told her there was more to him than anyone else seemed to realize. The Advanced Propulsion Systems laboratory buzzed with nervous energy as students filed in for their first major class. Jiho rolled his wheelchair between the tall workbenches, looking for a spot where he could actually reach the equipment. The lab had clearly been designed for taller species. Everything seemed to be at least a foot too high for him. "Professor." Vex entered the room with dramatic flair. The insectoid teacher's 6 arms moved independently as he gestured, his compound eyes scanning the diverse group of students. His voice clicked and buzzed as he spoke through the universal translator. "Welcome to Advanced Propulsion Systems," Professor Vex announced. "This semester, you will design and build actual spacecraft engines. Your first project will be atmospheric entry vehicles, capable of safely delivering cargo to planetary surfaces." Excited murmurs filled the room. This wasn't theoretical work. They would be building real ships that could actually fly. You will. Work in groups of 4, the professor continued. I have already assigned your teams based on complementary skills. Jiho's heart sank as he heard his name called alongside 3 Krillian students, Thrak, Vorn, and Kess. He recognized them from the arrival terminal. They were among the ones who had mocked his wheelchair. As he rolled over to their assigned workstation, he could already see the disappointment on their rocky faces. Great, Thrak muttered, his 4 arms crossed in obvious annoyance. We get stuck with the human. This is supposed to be advanced. Engineering, Vorn added, towering over Jiho's wheelchair. How are we supposed to compete when one of our team members can't even stand up? Kess, the largest of the 3, simply shook his massive head. We'll have to carry him. Do all the real work ourselves. From across the room, Mina watched the interaction with growing discomfort. She was paired with 3 other Altarians, all of whom seemed pleased with their intellectually superior group. But her attention kept drifting to the human and his obvious struggles with his teammates. Professor Vex began explaining the project requirements. The atmospheric entry vehicle needed to carry a 500-kilogram payload, survive temperatures of over 2,000 degrees, and land safely within a 10-meter target zone. The engineering challenges were enormous. All right, Thrak said, taking charge of their group. Vorn, you handle the hull design. Kess, work on the propulsion system. I'll manage the heat shielding. What about me? Jiho asked quietly. The 3 Krillians exchanged glances. How you can work on the math stuff, Thrak said dismissively. Figure out some calculations or whatever. We'll handle the important parts. They literally turned their backs on him, gathering around the main workstation to discuss their ideas. Jiho found himself pushed to the edge of the group, isolated with just a small data pad and basic calculator. Mina watched as the human student was completely excluded from his team's planning. Her telepathic abilities picked up his frustration, but also something else, intense concentration. While his teammates argued about materials and designs, Jiho was quietly running complex calculations on his datapad. The Krillians worked with typical brute force approaches. Their designs were massive, heavily armored, and required enormous amounts of power. They seemed to believe that bigger and stronger was always better. We need thicker armor plating, Vorn declared, sketching their vehicle design. And more powerful. Engines, Kess added. Triple redundancy on all systems. The heat shielding should be at least 3 layers thick, Thrak concluded. Meanwhile, Jiho worked alone on his calculations. He wasn't just doing random math. He was analyzing their entire approach from first principles. Every few minutes he would try to speak up with suggestions, but his teammates would wave him off. We've got this handled, they would say. Just focus on your numbers. But Jiho's numbers were telling a very different story. The Krillian's design was fundamentally flawed. It was too heavy, too power-hungry, and the heat distribution was all wrong. Their vehicle would either burn up on entry or crash catastrophically on landing. As the class period continued, Mina found herself paying more attention to the isolated human than her own project. There was something about the way he worked. Methodical, thoughtful, constantly checking and rechecking his calculations. His teammates were building something impressive-looking, but the humans seemed to be solving problems they hadn't even recognized yet. When Professor Vex announced they had 10 minutes left, the Krillians were proud of their preliminary design. It looked powerful and intimidating, covered in armor and bristling with engines. Jiho quietly raised his hand. I think there might be some issues with our approach, he said. What kind of issues? Thrak asked impatiently. Well, according to my calculations, our vehicle is going to be about 400% over the weight limit, and the heat distribution pattern means the cargo compartment will reach lethal temperatures during entry. The 3 Krillians stared at him blankly. They hadn't even considered weight limits or heat distribution in their eagerness to build something impressive. That's not possible, Vorn stammered. But as Jiho showed them his careful calculations, the flaws in their design became impossible to ignore. 3 weeks had passed since the project began, and testing day had finally arrived. The engineering lab hummed with excitement as teams prepared to test their atmospheric entry vehicle prototypes in the massive simulation chamber. The room-sized testing facility could recreate the intense heat and pressure of planetary entry, complete with artificial gravity fields and temperature sensors. Jiho sat quietly at the back of his team's workspace, watching Thrak, Vaughn and Kess make final adjustments to their prototype. The vehicle looked impressive, a hulking mass of metal and engines that seemed built to survive anything. The three Krillians had worked tirelessly, using their 4 arms each to assemble components that sparkled with advanced alien technology. "This is going to blow everyone else away," Thrak declared proudly, his rocky skin gleaming under the lab lights. "Look at that armor plating. Nothing's getting through that." "And those engines," Vaughn added, patting one of the massive propulsion units. "Triple redundancy means triple the power. This thing could probably survive flying into a star." Kess nodded approvingly. The other teams won't know what hit them. Throughout the 3 weeks, they had completely ignored Jiho's suggestions and calculations. Every time he tried to point out potential problems, they would brush him off with comments like, "Leave the real engineering to us," or "Stick to your math homework." Now, as he looked at their finished prototype, Jiho could see all the flaws his calculations had predicted coming together in one doomed design. "Teams, prepare for testing sequence Alpha," Professor Vex announced, his insectoid voice clicking through the speakers. "First up, Team Krillian-Human Hybrid." Mina looked up from her own team's work area. Her group had built an elegant crystalline vehicle that used Altarian telepathic guidance systems. It was beautiful and efficient, but she found herself more interested in watching what would happen with the humans team. The Krillian prototype was loaded into the testing chamber with great ceremony. Thrak operated the controls while Vaughn and Kess monitored the various systems. Jiho sat off to the side, quietly reviewing his calculations one more time. "Beginning atmospheric entry simulation," Professor Vex announced. At first, everything looked good. The prototype entered the simulated atmosphere smoothly, its engines firing perfectly. The Krillians grinned with satisfaction. "See?" Thrak whispered to his teammates. "I told you we didn't need the humans' help." But then the problem started. As the vehicle descended deeper into the simulated atmosphere, the temperature readings began climbing rapidly. The heat sensors showed dangerous levels of thermal buildup, exactly where Jiho had predicted they would occur. "Temperature warning in cargo compartment," the computer announced, "exceeding safe parameters." "That's impossible," Vaughn muttered, checking his displays. "We have triple-layer heat shielding." "It's not positioned correctly," Jiho said quietly, but nobody heard him over the alarms. The situation got worse quickly. The vehicle's massive weight, combined with its poor aerodynamic design, caused it to fall too fast. The engines, powerful as they were, couldn't provide enough lift to slow the descent properly. "Speed warning," the computer continued. "Exceeding safe landing velocity." "More power to engines," Kess shouted, frantically adjusting controls, but adding more power only made things worse. The additional engine thrust created uneven forces that sent the prototype spinning out of control. The massive vehicle tumbled through the simulated atmosphere like a falling rock. Then came the catastrophic failure Jiho had been dreading. The combination of excessive heat, unstable flight, and structural stress caused a critical system failure. The prototype's main engine exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The explosion was so violent that it overloaded the testing chamber's safety systems. Sparks flew from control panels around the lab as the simulation equipment struggled to contain. The virtual disaster. Emergency klaxons wailed as the chamber's force fields flickered dangerously. "Emergency shutdown," Professor Vex commanded, his 6 arms working frantically at the controls. The simulation ended abruptly, leaving smoking equipment and stunned silence. The Krillian prototype had been completely destroyed, and it had nearly taken the lab's testing facility with it. How did this happen?" Thrak stammered, staring at the smoking remains visible through the chamber's viewing window. "This is your fault," Vaughn, Kess accused. "Your engine design was flawed." "My engines were perfect," Vaughn shot back. "It was your heat shielding that failed." "Both of you are wrong," Thrak joined the argument. "The problem was the landing system, while The 3 Krillians argued loudly, blaming each other for the disaster. Jiho quietly wheeled his chair over to Professor Vex's station. The insectoid professor was running diagnostics on the damaged equipment, muttering complaints about reckless students. "Professor," Jiho said softly, "I have some alternative calculations I'd like to show you." Professor Vex's compound eyes focused on the human student. "Alternative calculations?" Jiho handed over his datapad, which contained 3 weeks of careful work. "I ran the numbers on our team's design from the beginning. I predicted the failure points and worked out a different approach." As Professor Vex studied the calculations, his expression changed from annoyance to surprise to genuine interest. The human's math was not only correct, but elegant. Instead of brute force solutions, Jiho had found ways to work with natural forces rather than against them. Across the room, Mina watched the quiet exchange. Her telepathic abilities picked up Professor Vex's growing amazement and Jiho's nervous hope. There was something special happening here, something the arguing Krillians were completely missing. "Fascinating," Professor Vex murmured, scrolling through Jiho's designs. "You've solved problems I didn't even realize existed." Professor Vex's compound eyes studied Jiho's calculations with growing fascination. The lab had fallen quiet after the Krillian prototype's spectacular failure, and other students were gathering around to see what had captured their professor's attention. "Mr. Kim," Professor Vex said, his clicking voice carrying across the silent room, "would you mind explaining your methodology to the class?" Jiho felt his heart racing as dozens of alien eyes turned toward him. The 3 Krillians had stopped, arguing, and were staring at him with confusion and irritation. He took a deep breath and wheeled his chair closer to the main display screen. "Well," Jiho began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I started by looking at what we couldn't do rather than what we could do." Several students exchanged puzzled glances. This was the opposite of how most species approached engineering problems. Jiho connected his datapad to the display system. Everyone else was trying to build the strongest, most powerful vehicle possible. But I asked myself, what if we can't use brute force? What if we have to work with limitations? His design appeared on the screen, and immediately it looked different from every other prototype in the lab. Where the others were bulky and heavily armored, Jiho's vehicle was sleek and streamlined. It looked almost fragile compared to the Krillian's failed monster. "You see, I'm used to working with constraints," Jiho continued, gesturing to his wheelchair. "Every day I have to figure out how to do things when the obvious solution isn't available to me. So I applied that thinking to this project." Mina found herself leaning forward, genuinely intrigued. Her telepathic senses picked up something unusual from the human, not the aggressive confidence of the Krillians or the cold calculation of her fellow Altarians, but a quiet certainty born from experience. "Instead of fighting atmospheric forces, I designed the vehicle to use them," Jiho explained. "The shape isn't just aerodynamic. It's designed to create specific air currents that help control the descent." He pulled up a simulation showing how air flowed around his design. Unlike the chaotic turbulence around other prototypes, the air moved in smooth, controlled patterns around Jiho's vehicle. "But how does it survive the heat without thick armor?" asked a Zephyrian student, her wings fluttering with curiosity. "It doesn't need to survive the heat," Jiho smiled. "It avoids it. The flight path I calculated uses the planet's atmosphere to shed heat naturally. The vehicle actually gets cooler as it descends, not hotter." Professor Vex's mandibles clicked with excitement. "Show them the resource comparison." Jiho brought up another chart, and gasps filled the room. His design used 40% less material than the average prototype, required 60% less engine power, and weighed half as much as the Krillian design. Yet the performance projections showed it would land more accurately and safely than any other design. "This is impossible," Thrak protested, his forearms gesturing angrily. "You can't get better performance with less power. That's not how engineering works." "It is if you think differently," Jiho replied calmly. "Look, when I want to reach something on a high shelf, I don't try to grow taller or jump higher. I find a tool that extends my reach, or I redesign the system so I don't need to reach up there in the first place." He pulled up another example from his calculations. "Same principle here. Instead of overpowering the problem, I redesigned the problem itself." The class fell silent as students processed this completely different approach to engineering. Most species relied on their natural advantages. Krillians used brute strength, Zephyrians used speed and agility, Altarians used superior intellect, but humans had to be creative. "Your species has no natural advantages," observed a crystalline student, her translucent body shimmering. "How do you compete?" "That's exactly why we can compete," Jiho said with growing confidence. "When you have natural advantages, you tend to rely on them. When you don't, you have to find entirely new ways to solve problems." After class ended, most students filed out discussing Jiho's revolutionary approach. The three Krillians left without saying a word, clearly embarrassed by their failure and the humans' success. But Mina lingered behind, her crystalline skin catching the lab's lights as she approached Jiho's workstation. "That was remarkable," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine respect that surprised them both. "I've never seen anyone approach engineering from that angle before." Jiho looked up at her, still processing the fact that an Altarian, a member of the galaxy's most intellectually superior species, was talking to him as an equal. "Most problems have more than one solution," he said simply. "I just look for the ones that work with what I have instead of what I wish I had." "Your people must be incredible problem solvers," Mina mused. Jiho's expression grew thoughtful. "We had to be. Earth wasn't the strongest planet or the fastest or the smartest, but we survived because we learned to adapt. We learned that limitations aren't obstacles, they're just design parameters." Mina felt something shift in her understanding. All her life she'd been taught that her people's telepathic abilities and superior intellect made them natural leaders. But watching this human work, she realized that there might be forms of intelligence that had nothing to do with raw mental power. "Would you—" She hesitated, unused to asking anyone for help. "Would you mind showing me more about this constraint-based thinking? I find it fascinating." Jiho's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire expression. For the first time since arriving at the Institute, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. "I'd be happy to," he said. "After all, the best solutions come from combining different perspectives." The emergency alarm started wailing at 2:47 a.m., jolting everyone on Nexus Station from their sleep. Red warning lights flashed through the corridors as the automated voice repeated its chilling message. "Critical reactor malfunction detected. All personnel report to emergency stations. This is not a drill." Jiho was already awake, studying for his next engineering exam, when the alarms began. He quickly transferred from his bed to his wheelchair and rolled out into the hallway. Chaos greeted him immediately. Students from dozens of species were running in all directions, some screaming in their native languages, others frozen in panic. The station's main reactor, a massive fusion core that powered everything from life support to gravity generators, was experiencing a cascade failure. If it couldn't be stabilized within hours, the entire station would lose power and drift helplessly in space. Worse yet, there was a real possibility of a catastrophic explosion that could destroy everything. In the main engineering section, Professor Vex was frantically coordinating with the station's emergency response team. His 6 arms moved independently as he tried to manage multiple crisis situations at once. The primary engineering staff were already working on the reactor, but they needed every available student to help with secondary systems. "Teams of 4, Professor Vex shouted over the alarms. "Krillians, use your strength to manually operate the backup power systems. Zephyrians, check the upper-level conduits that the rest of us can't reach. Altarians, use your telepathic abilities to coordinate between teams." The Krillian students immediately formed groups and headed toward the massive manual override switches. That required tremendous physical strength to operate. The Zephyrians took flight, soaring up to inspect power conduits near the station's ceiling. The Altarians linked their minds together, creating a telepathic network to share information instantly across the engineering section. But within minutes, it became clear that the traditional approaches weren't working. The Krillians, despite their incredible strength, couldn't operate the manual systems fast enough. The backup power grid was too complex, with thousands of switches and controls that needed to be coordinated precisely. "We need more power to the life support systems," shouted Chief Engineer Vortek, a massive Krillian with decades of experience. "The manual overrides aren't supplying enough energy. The Zephyrians were having their own problems. While they could easily reach the upper conduits, the damaged power lines were too heavy for them to repair. Their lightweight bodies, perfect for flight, weren't built for the heavy lifting required. "The main power trunk is severed," called down Zara, a senior Zephyrian student. "We can see the damage, but we can't move the components." Meanwhile, the Altarian telepathic network was becoming overwhelmed. Too much information was flowing through their shared consciousness. Damage reports, system failures, emergency protocols, and they were struggling to process it all coherently. Mina, part of the Altarian coordination team, felt the mental strain as dozens of thoughts crashed through her mind simultaneously. Through the chaos, she noticed something unexpected. Jiho, sitting calmly in his wheelchair near the main control panel, studying the station's power grid schematics on a portable display, while everyone else was running around trying to fix problems. With brute force, superior abilities, or overwhelming mental power, the human was simply thinking. "Jiho," Mina called out, breaking away from the telepathic network. "What are you doing?" "Looking for a different solution," he replied, without taking his eyes off the schematics. "All these approaches assume we need to restore the primary systems to full power. But what if we don't?" "What do you mean?" Jiho's fingers moved quickly across his display, tracing power pathways through the station's complex network. "Look at this. Everyone's trying to force power through the main channels, but they're damaged. It's like trying to push water through a broken pipe. You just waste energy and make things worse." He highlighted several alternative pathways on his screen. "But what if we use the secondary systems, the emergency lighting circuits, the waste processing power lines, even the recreational facility networks? Individually, they can't carry much power, but together they might be enough," Mina finished, her eyes widening as she understood his plan. "Exactly. It's not elegant, and it's not the way the system was designed to work, but it might keep us alive long enough to fix the main reactor." Jiho immediately began working the communication system, contacting repair teams throughout the station. But instead of giving orders, he asked questions. "Team Alpha, what's your current power output?" "Okay, can you reroute 15% of that through the auxiliary junction in Section C?" "Good, now connect that to the secondary life support grid." Mina watched in amazement as Jiho coordinated dozens of teams, treating the entire station like a giant puzzle that needed to be solved creatively. He wasn't using superior strength, flight, or telepathy, just clear thinking and the ability to see connections that others missed. "Team Beta, I need you to disconnect the gymnasium's power supply and feed it into the medical bay. I know it sounds crazy, but trust me on this." "Team Gamma, can you access the old maintenance tunnels? There are some backup power lines there that haven't been used in years, but they might still work." One by one, Jiho's unconventional solutions began working. Power started flowing through pathways that the station's original designers had never intended to use. Life support systems came back online, gravity generators stabilized, and critical systems received just enough power to keep functioning. Professor Vex, who had been watching the coordination efforts with growing amazement, approached Jiho's position. "How did you know those alternative pathways would work?" "I didn't," Jiho admitted. "But I knew the conventional approaches weren't working, so we had to try something different. When you can't overpower a problem, you have to outthink it." Chief Engineer Vorthak's voice crackled over the communication system. "Whatever you're doing down there, keep it up. We've got enough power to the primary systems now. Reactor stabilization in progress." Mina looked at Jiho with new understanding. All her life, she'd been taught that intelligence meant raw processing power. The ability to think faster, calculate more precisely, remember more details. But the human's intelligence was different. It was flexible, creative, adaptive. "Your species really is remarkable," she said quietly. "You don't just solve problems, you change what the problems mean." Jiho smiled, finally allowing himself to relax as the emergency alarms began to quiet. Sometimes the best solution isn't the obvious one. Sometimes you have to find a completely different way to look at things. The week after the reactor crisis, Mina found herself knocking on the door of Jiho's dormitory room. She'd been thinking about their conversation during the emergency, unable to shake the feeling that she'd witnessed something extraordinary. When Jiho opened the door, he looked surprised to see the crystalline Altarian standing in his doorway. "Mina, is everything okay?" "I want to learn," she said simply, "about your way of thinking, about solving problems differently." Jiho's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Really, I mean, that's great. Come in, come in." His room was smaller than the ones assigned to other species, modified for wheelchair accessibility. But what caught Mina's attention were the dozens of sketches and diagrams covering every surface, designs for ramps, modified control panels, adaptive tools, all solutions born from necessity. "What's all this?" she asked, examining a particularly clever design for a height-adjustable workbench. "Just stuff I work on in my spare time," Jiho said, a bit embarrassed. "Living here has made me realize how many things aren't designed for different body types. I've been sketching ideas for improvements." Mina studied the drawings more carefully. Each design was elegant and simple, solving complex accessibility problems with surprisingly straightforward solutions. "These are brilliant. Have you shown them to anyone? Who would care? They're just modifications for people like me." "That's where you're wrong," Mina said, her excitement growing. "Look at this workbench design. It doesn't just help wheelchair users. It would be perfect for Zephyrians who prefer to work while hovering, or for the smaller crystalline species who can't reach standard heights." Jiho looked at his sketches with new eyes. I never thought about that. That's what makes this so special," Mina continued. "You're not just solving problems for one group, you're creating solutions that work for everyone. It's universal design." Over the following weeks, their partnership blossomed into something neither had expected. Mina would visit Jiho's room every evening after classes, and together they would work on accessibility projects. Her Altarian intellect, combined with his human creativity, proved to be a powerful combination. Their first major collaboration was a redesigned laboratory workstation. Traditional labs were built for the average height and reach of the dominant species, leaving many students struggling to use the equipment effectively. "The problem is that everyone designs for the majority," Jiho explained, as they worked on the blueprints. "But if you design for the extremes, the shortest users, the tallest, those with limited mobility, you end up with something that works better for everyone." Their workstation could adjust its height automatically, sensing the user's physical needs and adapting accordingly. Control panels moved to optimal positions, tools organized themselves within easy reach, and work surfaces changed size and orientation based on the task at hand. "It's like the station's power grid during the emergency," Mina realized. Instead of forcing everyone to adapt to one rigid system, you created a flexible system that adapts to individual needs. Exactly. Constraints aren't limitations, they're design requirements that lead to better solutions. When they presented their prototype to Professor Vex, his compound eyes widened with interest. "This is remarkable work. The engineering is sound, but more importantly, it addresses needs I didn't even realize existed." Other students began taking notice of their collaboration. Initially, some were skeptical, particularly the Krillians, who still harbored resentment from their prototypes' failure. "Why waste time making things easier?" Thrak grumbled during one class discussion. "If someone can't handle standard equipment, maybe they shouldn't be here." "Because standard is arbitrary," Jiho replied calmly. "Your idea of standard is based on Krillian physiology. But there's nothing inherently superior about designing everything for four-armed, 8-foot-tall users." "Our strength is superior," Vaughn interjected. "For some tasks, yes, but not for precision work or fitting into small spaces or dozens of other applications." Jiho pulled up his latest project on the display screen. "Look at this tool I designed for circuit repair." The device looked almost delicate compared to typical Krillian engineering tools, but as Jiho demonstrated, it could perform repairs that would be impossible with larger, more powerful equipment. "The Zephyrians have been asking for something like this for months," Professor Vex noted. "Their talons are too large for fine electronic work. And the crystalline students need tools that won't crack their fragile limbs," Mina added. "This design works for everyone." As their reputation grew, students from various species began approaching Jiho and Mina with their own accessibility challenges. A Zephyrian student who struggled with ground-level controls, a crystalline who needed equipment that wouldn't shatter her delicate body, even some Krillians who admitted that their size sometimes worked against them in confined spaces. Each new challenge became an opportunity to innovate. Jiho would analyze the problem from his unique perspective, someone who had spent his life finding creative workarounds, while Mina applied her analytical abilities to refine and optimize the solutions. "I'm starting to understand something," Mina said one evening as they worked on a new project. "All my life I was taught that Alterian mental superiority made us natural leaders, but superiority based on just one trait is actually a weakness. Isn't it? How do you mean? When you rely too heavily on a single advantage, you become blind to other approaches. You assume your way is the only way, or at least the best way." She gestured to their collection of designs. But these solutions came from combining different perspectives, different limitations, different strengths. Jiho nodded thoughtfully. "That's what humans had to learn early on. We weren't the strongest or fastest species on Earth, so we had to be adaptable. We had to work together, combine our different abilities, find creative solutions. And that's made your species incredibly resilient," Mina observed. "Not despite your limitations, but because of how you've learned to work with them." Their partnership had become something more than just collaboration. It was a friendship built on mutual respect and shared discovery. More importantly, it was proof that the galaxy's greatest innovations might come not from individual superiority, but from bringing different perspectives together to solve problems in entirely new ways. "You know what I think?" Jiho said, looking at their latest creation, a communication device that worked equally well for telepathic and non-telepathic species. "I think we're just getting started." The announcement came during the morning assembly, when Director Zahn's grave voice echoed through the Institute's main auditorium. The massive holographic display showed a damaged colony ship drifting helplessly in space, its hull scarred by micrometeor impacts and system failures. "The colony ship New Horizon is dying," Director Zahn announced, her tentacled form shifting colors with emotional stress. 50,000 beings from 17 different species are trapped aboard. Their life support systems are failing. Their engines are offline and they have perhaps 6 weeks before total system collapse. A collective gasp filled the auditorium. 50,000 lives. It was almost unimaginable. The hologram zoomed in to show the ship's interior, revealing the scope of the disaster. Corridors filled with panicked beings, emergency lighting flickering and emergency crews struggling to maintain basic systems. "This is not a simulation," the director continued. "This is real. The Galactic Council has commissioned this institute to design emergency evacuation systems that can save as many lives as possible. Your senior project for this semester will be to create these systems." Jiho felt his heart pounding as the full magnitude of the challenge became clear. This wasn't just about grades or academic achievement. Real people were going to live or die based on what they designed. "The requirements are as follows," Director Zahn said, reading from her datapad. "First, the evacuation systems must work for all 17 species aboard the ship. These include everything from the tiny whisper folk, who are barely 6 inches, tall, to the massive Titan builders, who stand 12 feet high and weigh over a ton each." Professor Vex, sitting in the faculty section, clicked his mandibles nervously. Even he looked overwhelmed by the scope of the challenge. "Second," the director continued, "the systems must use minimal resources. The ship's fabrication facilities are severely damaged. You'll have access to basic materials only. Standard metals, simple electronics, and whatever supplies can be salvaged from the ship itself." Mina leaned over to whisper to Jiho, "How can you design for 17 different species with such limited resources?" "Third, power consumption must be kept to absolute minimum. The ship's reactor is operating at 15% capacity and failing further each day. Any evacuation system that requires significant power will simply accelerate the ship's death." The challenges seemed impossible. Different species had completely different physical needs. The aquatic depth swimmers needed water-filled environments. The crystalline shard people were incredibly fragile and could be injured by vibrations. That other species wouldn't even notice. The gas giant natives, the cloud dancers, needed specific atmospheric pressures to survive. Finally, Director Zahn said, speed is critical. Every day of delay means more system failures and greater risk of total catastrophe. You have 4 weeks to design, prototype, and test your solutions. The auditorium erupted in nervous chatter as students began discussing the challenge among themselves. Most were already talking about forming teams based on species, Krillians with Krillians, Altarians with Altarians, assuming that similar minds would work better together. Jiho, however, was thinking differently. The challenge reminded him of something he'd learned during the reactor crisis. Sometimes the best solutions came from combining different perspectives, not from grouping similar ones together. "This can't be done," declared Thrak loudly from several rows up. 17 species with completely different needs. It's impossible to design one system for everyone. "Maybe that's the problem," Jiho said quietly to Mina. "Everyone's thinking about designing one system for everyone." "What do you mean? What if we don't design one system? What if we design a system that can become many different systems?" Before Mina could respond, Director Zahn continued with more sobering details. The evacuation must handle not just the physical transportation of 50,000 beings, but also their survival needs during the evacuation process. Some species require specific atmospheric conditions, others need particular temperatures, and several cannot survive in the same environment as others. The holographic display showed the technical specifications: limited shuttle capacity, damaged docking bays, failing life support systems, and a power grid that could collapse at any moment. Each constraint seemed designed to make the problem harder. To make matters more complex, the director added, many of the beings aboard are already weakened by months of failing life support. They cannot endure the stress of traditional high-acceleration evacuation methods. Professor Vex stood up to address the students. "This is beyond anything you've faced before. You'll need to think creatively, work efficiently, and most importantly, remember that lives depend on your innovation." As the assembly ended and students filed out, Jiho noticed something interesting. Most were forming teams based on their natural advantages: Krillians planning to use brute force solutions, Zephyrians focusing on high-speed evacuations, Altarians developing complex telepathic coordination systems. But each approach had fundamental flaws. Brute force wouldn't work with limited power. High-speed evacuations would kill the weakened passengers. Complex systems would require resources and time they didn't have. "You're thinking about this differently, aren't you?" Mina asked as they walked toward the engineering labs. "I'm thinking about my wheelchair," Jiho replied. "When I first got it, I thought it was just a limitation, but over time, I realized it wasn't about the wheelchair being perfect for every situation. It was about the wheelchair being adaptable to different situations." "Modular design," Mina said, understanding immediately. "Exactly. What if we created evacuation components that could be combined in different ways depending on the species being evacuated? The same basic pieces, arranged differently for different needs." They entered the lab to find other teams already claiming workstations and beginning their preliminary designs. The Krillian teams were sketching massive, powerful evacuation pods. The Zephyrian groups were designing high-speed atmospheric escape systems. The Altarian teams were developing telepathically coordinated evacuation networks, all impressive solutions, but each designed with only their own species' capabilities in mind. "Look around," Jiho whispered to Mina. "Everyone's designing based on what they're good at, not what the problem actually requires." "So what does the problem actually require?" Jiho was quiet for a moment, thinking about 50,000 beings, trapped in a dying ship, each with different needs, different limitations, different fears. "It requires us to design for everyone, not just anyone." As they claimed a small workstation in the corner, Jiho realized this challenge would test everything he'd learned about working with constraints, about finding creative solutions when obvious approaches failed, and about the power of thinking differently. The question was, could human adaptability, combined with Altarian intelligence and a deep understanding of universal design principles, create something that could save 50,000 lives? Time would tell. 2 weeks into the evacuation project, the Institute's engineering labs had become a battlefield of frustrated designs and failed prototypes. Teams worked around the clock, but the complexity of accommodating 17 different species was proving overwhelming for everyone. Jiho rolled his wheelchair between the various workstations, observing the struggles firsthand. The Krillian teams had built impressive evacuation pods, but they were massive and required enormous amounts of power. Each pod could only accommodate their own species, meaning they'd need 17 different designs, an impossible manufacturing task given the ship's limited resources. At the Zephyrian workstation, the bird-like students had created sleek, high-speed escape vehicles that could evacuate beings quickly through atmospheric flight. But their design assumed all passengers could withstand high G-forces and rapid acceleration, conditions that would kill the weakened, elderly, and injured aboard the failing ship. "Our atmospheric escape system can evacuate 1,000 beings per hour," boasted Silex, a senior Zephyrian student, his iridescent wings catching the lab's lights. "No other team can match that speed." "But what about the depth swimmers?" asked Jiho quietly. "They need water environments. Your system would dehydrate them in minutes." Silex's feathers ruffled with irritation. That's a separate problem. Other teams can handle the aquatic species." The Altarian teams weren't faring much better. Their telepathically coordinated systems were elegant and sophisticated, but they only worked for telepathic species. The majority of beings aboard the ship couldn't interface with their mental networks at all. Mina watched her fellow Altarians struggle with growing frustration. "We've created the most efficient coordination system possible," insisted Kale, her former study partner. "If only every species had proper telepathic abilities, this would be simple." "But they don't," Mina replied. "We have to work with what they have, not what we wish they had." Meanwhile, at their corner workstation, Jiho and Mina had taken a completely different approach. Instead of designing separate systems for each species, they were creating modular components that could be assembled differently based on immediate needs. "Show me again how this works," Mina said, studying their prototype. Jiho activated their demonstration model, a basic evacuation pod that looked almost disappointingly simple compared to the elaborate designs around them. But as he began reconfiguring its brilliance became apparent. "The base unit provides life support and propulsion," he explained, his hands moving confidently over the controls. "But watch what happens when we add different modules." He attached a water-filled compartment to one side. Now it can handle aquatic species. He swapped that for a pressure chamber. Now it's configured for gas giant natives. Another quick change added restraint systems suitable for the fragile crystalline people. "The beautiful part is that all these modules use the same connection system," Jiho continued. "Any pod can be reconfigured for any species in under 5 minutes using components that can be mass-produced with basic fabrication equipment." Professor Vex had been making rounds, checking on each team's progress. When he reached their workstation, his compound eyes focused intently on their prototype. "Interesting approach," he clicked, "but how do you handle the power requirements for 17 different life support systems?" "We don't," Jiho smiled. "Each module only provides the absolute minimum life support needed for transport. The pods aren't meant to be permanent habitats, just temporary bridges to get people from the dying ship to safety." "And the fabrication requirements?" Mina pulled up their resource calculations. 80% of our components are identical across all configurations. Instead of building 17 different systems, we're building one system with 17 different configurations." Word of their innovative approach began spreading through the lab. Students from other teams started gathering around their workstation, initially skeptical but increasingly impressed as they understood the implications. "This is impossible," Thrak declared, his forearms crossed defiantly. "You can't possibly meet the specific needs of every species with such a simple design." "Want to test that theory?" Jiho asked calmly. He called up the technical specifications. "For the Titan builders, the massive, heavy species that required reinforced everything." Within minutes, He had reconfigured their prototype to handle a 1,000-kilogram passenger, complete with the structural reinforcement and enhanced life support needed. "Now watch," he said, beginning another reconfiguration. Same basic components, different arrangement. In less than 4 minutes, the pod had been transformed to safely transport the tiny whisper folk with delicate restraint systems and microscaled life support appropriate for 6-inch tall passengers. The gathered students fell silent. Even Thrak's rocky features showed grudging amazement. "How did you know how to do that?" asked a crystalline student, her translucent body shimmering with curiosity. "Experience," Jiho replied simply. "I've spent my whole life adapting to environments that weren't designed for me. Every building I enter, every tool I use, every system I interact with, I have to figure out how to make it work with my limitations." "But these aren't limitations," Professor Vex observed. "You've turned constraints into design advantages." "Exactly," Mina added, finally understanding the full scope of what they'd accomplished. Jiho didn't design around the species' differences. He designed a system that embraces and accommodates those differences. As the demonstration continued, more teams abandoned their own struggling projects to observe. The Krillian teams watched in stunned silence as their impossible multi-species problem was solved with elegant simplicity. The Zephyrians realized that their high-speed approach had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Even the Altarians had to admit that telepathic coordination wasn't necessary when the system itself was intuitive enough for anyone to operate. "The really beautiful part," Jiho continued, warming to his explanation, "is that this modular approach actually makes the evacuation more efficient. Instead of needing specialized teams for each species, any rescue crew can reconfigure any pod for any passenger in minutes." "And if components fail?" asked Professor Vex. "Redundancy through modularity," Mina replied. "If one type of module fails, you can substitute a different one. The system degrades gracefully instead of failing catastrophically." Director Zahn appeared at the edge of the crowd, having heard about the breakthrough. As she examined their prototype, her tentacles shifted through colors of amazement and approval. "This is remarkable work," she said finally. "You've solved not just the technical challenge, but the logistical and manufacturing challenges as well." 6 months later, the evacuation of the New Horizon had become legendary throughout the galaxy. Jiho and Mina's modular system had indeed saved 47,000 lives, working flawlessly even as the colony ship's final systems failed. News broadcasts across dozens of worlds showed beings of all species emerging safely from identical-looking pods that had somehow met each of their unique needs perfectly. The morning after graduation ceremonies, Jiho was packing his few belongings when a knock came at his door. He expected to see Mina, who had been helping him prepare for his return to Earth, but instead found Director Zahn standing in his doorway. "Director, is everything all right?" Her tentacles shifted to calm blue hues as she entered his small room. "Mr. Kim, I have a proposition for you. The Galactic Institute would like to offer you a permanent position on our faculty." Jiho nearly dropped the data pad he was holding. "A teaching position? But I'm just a student. I haven't even started my career yet." "You've already demonstrated something far more valuable than years of traditional experience," Director Zahn replied. "You've shown an entirely new way of approaching engineering problems. We want to create a new department, adaptive engineering, with you as its head." The offer was overwhelming. Jiho had grown up dreaming of working as an engineer, but teaching at the galaxy's most prestigious institute? It seemed impossible. I don't know what to say. This is incredible, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach others." "Mr. Kim," the director said gently, "the greatest teachers aren't those who know the most facts. They're those who can show others how to think differently. Your evacuation system didn't just save lives. It changed how every engineer in this galaxy thinks about design constraints." After Director Zahn left, Jiho sat in his wheelchair staring out at the stars beyond his window. Everything had changed so dramatically from that first day when he'd been mocked and dismissed. Now he was being offered the chance to help shape how future engineers would approach problems. Mina arrived an hour later, her crystalline skin practically glowing with excitement. "I heard the news," Director Zahn told me about the teaching offer. Are you going to accept? I think so, Jiho said slowly. It's terrifying, but I keep thinking about all the students who might face the same challenges I did. Maybe I can help them see that being different isn't a disadvantage. You already have, Mina smiled. Do you know how many students have changed their approach to engineering because of what you've shown us? Even the Krillians are starting to think about adaptive design. 3 months later, Professor Jiho Kim stood in front of his first class of new students. The lecture hall was packed with beings from across the galaxy, Krillians, Zephyrians, Altarians, and dozens of other species, all eager to learn about this revolutionary approach to engineering. Among the students, he spotted several in mobility, devices like his own, others with visible physical differences, and many who simply looked eager to learn something new. In the front row, Mina sat as his teaching assistant, having chosen to stay at the Institute to help develop the new adaptive engineering program. Welcome to Introduction to Adaptive Engineering, Jiho began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall speakers. Before we start, I want to tell you a story about a human student who arrived at this institute convinced he was at a disadvantage. He gestured to his wheelchair with a smile. This student was mocked by his classmates, dismissed by his teammates, and told repeatedly that he didn't belong in advanced engineering. Everything about this place seemed designed for beings bigger, stronger, and more capable than he was. The lecture hall was completely silent, every student hanging on his words. But that student learned something important here. He learned that constraints aren't obstacles, they're design parameters. Limitations aren't weaknesses, they're opportunities for innovation. And being different isn't a disadvantage. It's a unique perspective that can solve problems others can't even see. Jiho moved his wheelchair to the center of the stage, making eye contact with students throughout the hall. Every species in this room has natural advantages. Krillians have incredible strength, Zephyrians have speed and flight, Altarians have superior mental processing. But you know what? Those advantages can become limitations if you rely on them too heavily. He pulled up a holographic display showing various engineering challenges. When you assume your natural advantages are the solution to every problem, you stop looking for creative alternatives. When you design only for beings like yourself, you miss opportunities to create something better. A young Krillian student raised one of her 4 hands. But, Professor, how can limitations be better than advantages? Great question, Jiho smiled. Let me show you something. He activated a simulation of their colony ship evacuation system. This system saved 47,000 lives. It was designed by a human who couldn't walk and an Altarian who learned to think beyond telepathic solutions. It succeeded because it had to work for everyone, not just for beings with specific advantages. The simulation showed the modular pods reconfiguring for different species, demonstrating the elegant simplicity that had emerged from embracing constraints rather than fighting them. The most innovative solutions in galactic history haven't come from the strongest, fastest, or smartest beings, Jiho continued. They've come from beings who had to think differently because conventional approaches weren't available to them. He paused, looking around the room at the diverse collection of students. Each of you has something unique to offer. Your challenges, your limitations, your different ways of seeing the world, these aren't things to overcome. They're tools for innovation. A crystalline student, her translucent body catching the light, spoke up timidly. But what if we're not strong enough or smart enough for traditional engineering? Then you'll have to be creative enough for revolutionary engineering, Jiho replied. Some of the greatest breakthroughs in galactic technology have come from beings who couldn't use traditional approaches and had to invent new ones. As the lecture continued, Jiho shared examples from across the galaxy, innovations that had emerged from constraint, creativity born from necessity, solutions that worked precisely because they had to accommodate limitations. Your assignment for next week is simple, he concluded. I want you to identify one constraint in your life, something that makes standard approaches difficult or impossible for you. Then I want you to design something that turns that constraint into an advantage. As students filed out of the lecture, Hull chattering excitedly about the assignment, Mina approached the podium. "How do you feel, Professor Kim?" she asked with a grin. Jiho looked out at the students leaving, beings from across the galaxy who would now approach engineering with a fundamentally different mindset. Some would go on to design technologies that accommodated differences rather than ignoring them. Others would solve problems that had seemed impossible by finding entirely new ways to think about them. "I feel like we're just getting started," he said. "These students are going to change how the galaxy thinks about design, about capability, about what's possible when you embrace constraints instead of fighting them." "And it all started with a human who refused to let limitations define him," Mina observed. "No," Jiho corrected gently. "It started with a human who learned that limitations don't define you. They refine you. They force you to find better solutions, more creative approaches, more inclusive designs." He looked around the empty lecture hall, thinking about all the students who would pass through these doors in years to come. True capability isn't about what you can do with unlimited resources and natural advantages. It's about what you choose to do with exactly what you have, right where you are with all your constraints intact. As they left the lecture hall together, Jiho realized that his journey from mocked outsider to respected professor had taught him the most important lesson of all. The galaxy's greatest innovations would come not from overcoming human limitations, but from embracing them as the foundation for thinking that no other species could replicate. Thrak, Vaughn, and Kess, Jiho's original teammates who had dismissed him so completely, stood at the back of the crowd in stunned silence. The human they had mocked as useless had just created a solution that none of their powerful, sophisticated approaches could match. "How many lives could this system theoretically save?" Director Zahn asked. Jiho consulted his calculations. "With the ship's current fabrication capacity and power limitations, we estimate 47,000 beings could be evacuated safely before total system failure." The number hung in the air like a challenge to everything the other teams had assumed was possible. 47,000 lives, saved not through superior strength, advanced technology, or telepathic coordination, but through the simple human insight that the best solutions work for everyone, not just anyone.